December 17th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. 2 o'clock in the morning. General Hasso von Manteuffel is 47 years old. He has been a soldier his entire adult life, cavalry cadet at 17, infantry officer in the First World War at 18, professional soldier through the Weimar years when the German army was limited to 100,000 men, and every officer position was competed for by men who understood that the army was the institution and the institution was their life. He survived the Eastern Front, the brutal, grinding retreat through Romania, the defensive campaigns of East Prussia. He was given command of the 5th Panzer Army on September 1st of this year, personally at Hitler's headquarters in Rastenburg over lunch, specifically because Hitler believed he was the kind of commander who could find the narrow margin in an impossible operational situation. He is standing in a forward command post looking at a map of his own country. The map was printed in Berlin in 1938. It is a standard Wehrmacht topographic sheet, 1 to 100,000 scale, the product of the Reichsamt für Landesaufnahmen, the Reich Survey Office, and it represents the finest pre-war German cartographic work. The survey data is accurate, the draftsmanship is precise, the contour lines are correct. When it was printed, it was an excellent map. It shows a road beginning near the Belgian village of Clairvaux, running northeast through the Ardennes forest toward the Our River. Von Manteuffel's operational plan for Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes counteroffensive that began 36 hours ago, depends on this road's existence at this location. He has positioned tank columns behind tank columns behind tank columns in the forest behind him, each one waiting for the vehicle ahead to clear the next bend before it can move, because the forest roads are too narrow for anything else, and because the timetable that OKW has imposed on this operation has no tolerance for routes that exist only on paper. His reconnaissance officer returned 90 minutes ago with a report that took 4 minutes to deliver and considerably longer to fully absorb. The road on the map does not match the road in the forest. A new bridge has been constructed where the map shows a ford, built in 1942 during the German military administration of Belgium, for reasons that had nothing to do with planning a tank offensive in 1944 and everything to do with the local lumber industry. A logging trail branches south at a point where the map shows undifferentiated forest. The main route has been widened and partially paved, the work completed between 1941 and 1943, and the paving has shifted the road centerline by approximately 40 meters, not a significant distance in any context except the one where your lead tank is navigating by compass bearing and the bearing was set from a map that is wrong. The offensive is 24 hours old. It has not yet failed. But von Manteuffel is a professional, and professionals know the difference between a plan that is working and a plan that has not yet visibly stopped working. And what he is looking at in the gray pre-dawn darkness of the Ardennes is a map that has been quietly lying to him since the moment his staff unfolded it. Then the captured materials arrive. Standard procedure after any contact with enemy forces. Search the dead and the prisoners. Collect documents, maps, orders, code books, anything that can be immediately exploited or transmitted up the intelligence chain. From the Americans' overrun in the first hours of the offensive, von Manteuffel's staff has collected a substantial haul. Most of it is standard. Unit orders, personal letters, the ordinary debris of a front that was surprised. But one of his staff officers has been staring at a particular sheet for several minutes, and brings it to von Manteuffel without speaking, simply handing it over. It is an American Army map, Series M641, scale 1 to 100,000, the same scale as the German sheet on the table beside it. It was printed by the Army Map Service in a building in Brookmont, Maryland, based on aerial photography flown over this area of Belgium and Germany during the summer of 1944, 5 months ago. The paper is slightly different from German military paper. The typography uses American conventions. The coordinate grid is in the military grid reference system, rather than the Gauss-Kruger system used on German sheets. The new bridge is marked. The logging track is shown, labeled with the trail designation from the Belgian Forestry Authority. The paved road alignment is correct, with the road centerline in the position it was surveyed to occupy after the 1942 widening, to within tolerances that von Manteuffel's staff will later estimate at a few meters. The German sheet of the same territory was surveyed in the late 1930s and printed in 1938. The American sheet of the same territory was photographed in the summer of 1944. Von Manteuffel's staff officers pass the American sheet around in the candlelit command post. They are looking at a piece of paper produced in a building most of them have never heard of, in a country 3,000 miles away, by an organization that did not exist in its current form when the war began, and it is showing them their own country more accurately than their own army's maps. One of them says something that travels up the chain to von Manteuffel himself, and that he will repeat in post-war interviews, and that has attached itself to this story in every account since. The American maps, the officer says, are unfair. Stop at that word. These are professional soldiers with 5 years of war behind them. They have seen things that should have stripped away every naivety about how conflict operates. They have watched the Luftwaffe's early supremacy dissolve, watched the tank advantage narrow and then reverse, watched the logistical advantages of interior lines disappear under Allied air power. They have seen many things that were militarily disadvantageous. None of those things produced the word unfair. A map did. Unfair. As if the Americans had violated some agreement about which side was entitled to know the terrain. As if showing up to fight on German-administered soil with a more accurate map of that soil than the Germans possessed was a form of cheating. As if the advantage of fighting on familiar ground, the advantage that every military theorist from Sun Tzu to Clausewitz had assigned to the defender, that every army throughout the history of European warfare had counted on as the minimum compensation for being the side that did not choose to attack, had been taken away by a piece of paper. This is the forensic account of how that happened. It begins 22 months earlier in the mountains of central Tunisia, with an American lieutenant who could not read his map because his map could not be read, and it ends in a command post in the Ardennes, where a German general held the evidence of the American system in his hands and could find no word for the experience except the one that acknowledged, without quite naming, that the system had beaten him before the first tank moved. February 19, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia, 6 o'clock in the morning. The United States Army had been in North Africa for 3 months. It had fought one serious engagement with the Wehrmacht in January and had come away confident. The equipment was good, the numbers were building, the men were learning. The consensus among American officers in Tunisia in early February 1943 was that the Germans were beatable. On February 14th, Rommel struck at Sidi Bouzid. By February 19th, the American Second Corps was retreating through the Kasserine Pass in the dorsal mountains, with German armor close enough behind that officers could hear the engine noise before they could see the vehicles. 2 American infantry regiments had been surrounded and destroyed. 200 tanks had been lost or abandoned. More than 100 artillery pieces were scattered across miles of desert. 6,500 men were dead, wounded, or captured. The worst defeat the United States Army would suffer in the European theater. The cartographic dimension of this disaster has been overshadowed by the tactical and command failures, the dispersion of forces, the incompetent corps commander, the chronic underestimation of German operational speed. But it was present, and it was structural, and it was not incidental to the other failures. It was part of the same problem. The maps issued to American units in Tunisia were French colonial survey sheets produced in Algiers in the early 1930s at a scale of 1 to 200,000. At this scale, 1 centimeter represents 2 kilometers. The contour interval was 40 meters, meaning that a ridge 200 feet high might have only 1 or 2 contour lines crossing it. Not enough information to tell a company commander whether his position was on a slope or a summit, whether the ground in front of him fell away steeply or gradually, whether the terrain between his position and the next hill was trafficable by wheeled vehicles or only by men on foot. Inland from the coast, the survey data degraded further. The French had mapped the Mediterranean littoral carefully, for economic reasons. The interior mountains, where the fighting was, had been surveyed approximately by teams that were doing the minimum work consistent with producing a map that looked complete. The result was a sheet that showed which large features existed and almost nothing useful about how they related to each other at the scale that determined whether a platoon could hold a ridge, whether a column could move, whether the hill labeled 412 was actually located where the printed number said it was. American units resolved this problem in various ways, none of them satisfactory. Some used the French colonial sheets as best they could, accepting that they were navigating by approximation. Some acquired commercial products, the Michelin tourist road atlases sold at French petrol stations in the late 1930s, which contained more accurate road data than the military sheets for the simple reason that Michelin's commercial surveyors had actually driven the roads and measured the distances. Patton, according to one well-documented account, used exactly such an atlas for planning early Third Army movements. This is not evidence of recklessness. It is evidence of how bad the official sheets were. The commanding general of Second Corps, Lloyd Friedendahl, had established his headquarters in a ravine at Tebessa, 70 miles behind the front line. He had never personally visited the positions he commanded. He communicated with his subordinate commanders in a private code of his own invention, a code so idiosyncratic that his own staff sometimes could not decode his orders without extended effort. When Rommel's attack came, Friedendahl was making decisions about ground he had never seen, through a communication system that added delay and confusion to every transaction, guided by map sheets that could not tell him what the ground actually looked like. He was relieved 10 days after Kasserine. His replacement was Patton. But the command failure alone could not account for what Kasserine had exposed, because Kasserine was a symptom of something broader. The United States Army had gone to war with a cartographic program that was adequate for the United States itself and almost useless for the foreign terrain where it would fight. There were no warehouses full of detailed topographic sheets of Tunisia, Sicily, France, or Germany. There was no peacetime tradition of systematically mapping foreign countries. There were no procedures for rapidly updating map data from aerial photography in the field. There was, in the most basic sense, no system. After Kasserine, the Army Map Service received orders to become one. The Army Map Service had existed in various institutional forms since the First World War. It was named after a man named Charles Ruth, a captain in the Army Corps of Engineers who had built the original engineer reproduction plant between 1917 and 1919, when the United States had discovered, in the same way it would discover again in 1943, that going to war in a foreign country without maps was a problem that could not be solved after the war began. The ERP produced 9 million maps between 1917 and 1919. Ruth left the Army in 1919 and joined a newspaper. The facility contracted. In 1941, Congress passed legislation funding the mapping of any territory the Secretary of War deemed strategic. The 77th Congress understood, watching Europe fight, that maps would matter. What it did not yet understand was where the people to make them would come from. The Army Map Service had, in 1942, a corps of trained military cartographers. It had dozens of them. It needed thousands. The skills required, photogrammetric computation, cartographic drafting, coordinate verification, quality control against independent sources, were technical and learnable, but not common. They were taught at certain universities in geography departments. They were applied, by the people who learned them, in survey agencies, commercial cartographic firms, and academic geography programs. They were applied, in 1942, almost entirely by men. And the men were unavailable because the men were being drafted. The solution required someone to recognize that the reservoir of trained geographical skill in the United States was not being used because the people who had it were women. Edith Putnam Parker was 56 years old in 1942. She had been a geography professor and textbook author for 2 decades. She understood, with the precision of someone who had spent her career thinking about how spatial reasoning was taught, what the minimum curriculum would look like for someone who needed to make maps rather than study them. She designed a 60-hour course. It covered the geometry of aerial photograph interpretation, the mechanics of stereoscopic viewing, the computation of elevation from parallax measurements, the drafting conventions of military topographic sheets, and the quality control procedures that ensured the output was correct before it went to print. It was not a full professional education. It was exactly enough to make a person useful in a production pipeline under experienced supervision. Parker understood the distinction, and she built accordingly. The Engineering, Science, and Management War Training Program funded the curriculum at colleges across the Midwest and South. In its first year, 1942, 200 women completed it. In subsequent years, as the program expanded, thousands more enrolled and graduated and reported to the Army Map Service. They were called, by the editor of the AMS newsletter, the Military Mapping Maidens, the 3M Girls. The name had a slightly patronizing quality that the women who carried it were aware of and largely unbothered by, because the work they were doing was the work, and the name was just a name. And by 1944, the work was too important and too relentless for anyone to spend much time on the question of what they were being called. Beatrice Shaheen was 22 years old in the spring of 1943, a senior geography major at Kent State University in Ohio, planning to become an elementary school teacher. She had liked maps since childhood, in the way that some people find a particular representation of the world more legible than the world itself. Her professor, Edna Eisen, asked if she would be interested in a special training program for the war effort. She graduated in June. In July, she reported to the Charles Ruth Building on MacArthur Boulevard in Brookmont, Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. She was assigned as a drafter. The Ruth Building was a converted industrial structure in a residential neighborhood, and its wartime importance was considered significant enough that it had been camouflaged, the roof and walls painted to break up its outline from the air, to make it look from above like an extension of the residential streets around it, rather than a military facility producing hundreds of thousands of map sheets. The camouflage struck McPherson as slightly absurd when she thought about it. The building was producing paper, not explosives, and the Germans presumably had a general sense of where American map-making operations were located. But the classification level of the work inside was high, and the Army's approach to the security of high classification facilities was consistent, regardless of the nature of the material. The culture inside the Ruth Building was one that B. McPherson would describe, years later, as professional in the specific way that organizations are professional when they know the work matters. Not military professional. Most of the women working there were civilians, recruited through the training program, drawing government salaries, wearing civilian clothes. But professional in the sense of taking the quality of the output seriously, of understanding that the sheet you were checking would eventually reach someone in a foreign country who would be making decisions based on what it showed, and that an error in your checking was an error that person would encounter in the field, possibly at a moment when an error was not recoverable. The photogrammetric sections process the aerial photography. The drafting sections turn the processed data into map sheets. McPherson was a drafter. Her tools were the standard instruments of technical cartography: ruling pens, scribing tools, drafting templates, the specialized symbols that conveyed road type, bridge load rating, vegetation cover, and building footprint in the compressed language of topographic convention. Her substrate was a sheet of stable base drafting film, chosen because paper stretches and film does not, and a map that stretched in humidity would give wrong coordinates to the soldier using it. She was good at this work. The aptitude tests administered during Parker's 60-hour program had identified her as having strong spatial reasoning and fine motor control, the two non-negotiable requirements for production drafting. She was fast without being imprecise, which was rarer than it sounds. Production drafting at the scale the Army Map Service was operating in 1943 and 1944 required a person who could maintain accuracy across 8 hours of repetitive technical work without the accumulated fatigue of attention causing the quality to drift downward in the late afternoon. The quality control process verified her output against independent sources before any sheet went to printing. A different person at a different light table checked her contour lines against the photogrammetric computation that had generated them. A senior cartographer reviewed the overall sheet for internal consistency, the contour lines that should meet at a summit actually meeting, the road network that should connect actually connecting, the coordinates at the sheet margins matching the coordinates on the adjacent sheet. The verification was thorough because the consequences of a missed error were not recoverable after the sheet went to press. Printing 70 million copies of a map with a wrong bridge location was not a problem you fixed after the fact. They were large, flat surfaces illuminated from beneath, designed to allow a cartographer to place a photographic transparency on the table, lay the map sheet or drafting material above it, and trace features from the photograph onto the sheet in transmitted light. The aerial photographs arrived in batches. Rolls of film, contact prints, and large prints for specific areas of interest, and were processed through the photogrammetric sections before reaching the drafting floor. McPherson's job was to take the processed data and translate it into the contour lines, road symbols, and feature annotations that made a map legible to a soldier who had never seen the terrain. The quality control process was rigorous. Every sheet was checked against independent sources before it went to the printing section, cross-referencing against existing surveys where they existed. Verification against overlapping photographs from different missions. Spot checks against ground intelligence reports from occupied territories. The AMS's tolerance standards for positional accuracy were tighter than any previous American cartographic program had required, because the people using these sheets would be navigating in the dark, under fire, at night, in foreign countries, and a positional error of 100 meters could put a patrol into a minefield or a column into an ambush. In the spring of 1944, the tempo changed. Generals and colonels began appearing in the cartography room, visitors who did not normally come to watch drafters work. The regular production schedule was suspended, and the entire floor was shifted to a special project. McPherson and her colleagues worked continuously through extended shifts and into early morning hours on sheets whose coordinate ranges she recognized from her geography training as the coast of northern France. She did not know the operational code name. She did not need to. The concentration of effort, the rank of the visitors, the geographic location of the coordinates, it was not difficult to understand, in general terms, what was being prepared. On June 6, 1944, she heard on the radio that the Normandy invasion had begun. Then her supervisor told the drafting room what they had been working on. The Army Map Service had produced, for Operation Overlord, approximately 3,000 distinct map sheets at various scales, totaling 70 million individual printed copies. The sheets had been produced at 1 to 25,000 for the beach assault areas, a scale detailed enough to show individual buildings, the widths of beach obstacles, the shadows cast by hedgerow embankments and low-sun aerial photographs. At 1 to 50,000 for the immediate inland areas. At 1 to 100,000 for the operational depth, the territory that Corps and Army commanders would need to navigate as the breakout developed. The information on those sheets had been provided by men flying alone over occupied France without guns. The Lockheed F-5 Lightning was a P-38 fighter from which all armament had been removed. The guns, the ammunition, the armor around the ammunition bays, all of it stripped out and replaced with cameras. 3 cameras in the nose for forward oblique and vertical photography, 2 in the fuselage, a larger fuel tank to extend the range beyond what a fighter needed and toward what a reconnaissance aircraft required. The stripped airframe was faster than the armed P-38 by a meaningful margin, because weight and drag had been removed. The pilots of the 10th Photo Reconnaissance Group, based in England, flew these aircraft alone, not in pairs, not in flights, alone. The standard fighter pilot's protective logic, wingman, mutual cover, someone to watch your 6 o'clock, did not apply to reconnaissance, because reconnaissance aircraft could not fight, and a second aircraft in formation doubled the probability of detection without providing any defensive capability. You went alone because going alone gave you the best chance of coming back. If you were intercepted, your options were speed and altitude and cloud cover. The F-5 could run from most German fighters in a straight line at altitude. It could hide in clouds if clouds existed. It could not fight. Its only weapon was the camera in its nose, and the camera required the aircraft to fly straight and level over the target at a predictable altitude for the duration of the photographic pass. The moment of maximum vulnerability. The moment when a gunner on the ground with a clear shot at a known altitude and heading had the best chance he would ever have. For the pre-invasion photography of the Normandy beaches, the pilots flew at between 15 and 50 feet above the channel surface, below German radar coverage, approaching the French coast at 350 knots. 50 feet, the height of a 5-story building. At 350 knots, which is approximately 400 miles per hour. At that altitude, the German soldiers in the beach fortifications were not looking up at the aircraft. They were looking across at it. A man in a bunker on the beach, watching an F-5 come in at 50 feet, was not trying to angle his weapon upward. He was leveling it. First Lieutenant James E. Wicker of Monticello, Georgia, flew one of these missions on June 6th itself, after the assault had begun, while the beaches were still contested, to photograph German troop concentrations at Chateau d'Un. He encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire at the target and returned with his photographs. The 7th Photo Reconnaissance Group, to which he belonged, received the Distinguished Unit Citation for its operations during May and June 1944. The citation mentions bridges, marshalling yards, canals, highways, rivers. It does not name individual pilots. The architecture of military recognition is not built for the kind of contribution that arrives in the form of a film canister handed to a laboratory technician whose output reaches the drafting floor weeks later, whose effect arrives in Normandy as a 1 to 25,000 sheet in the hands of an infantry officer who will never know where the sheet came from. The chain was real. The men and women in it generally did not know each other. That was the point. The specific missions flown over Germany itself, the deep penetration photography that produced the coverage of the Rhine crossings, the road network behind the Siegfried Line, the industrial infrastructure of the Ruhr, required a different operational approach than the Normandy beach photography. Over Germany, the preferred altitude was 30,000 feet or above, where anti-aircraft fire was less accurate and where most German fighter models were operating near their service ceilings. At 30,000 feet, a single F-5 was a small blue-painted shape against the sky, visible to observers on the ground but difficult to engage effectively. The pilots learned to fly straight and level for the photographic pass, the most dangerous 15 to 30 seconds of any mission, when the aircraft was predictable and the cameras required it, and to break away immediately afterward into a climbing turn that used the F-5 speed advantage to deny any pursuing fighter a steady shooting solution. They flew those missions in weather that grounded fighter operations. They flew them through contrail levels that made them visible for 50 miles. They flew through anti-aircraft concentrations that covered target areas so thoroughly that the post-mission aircraft inspection sometimes found shrapnel embedded in the airframe that the pilot had not noticed taking. The standard operational principle for photo reconnaissance was simple and unforgiving. The photograph was the mission, and if you came back without usable imagery, you had not completed the mission, regardless of what else had happened. A film canister full of blurred frames because the pilot had maneuvered evasively during the photographic run was a failure. A film canister full of sharp, properly exposed frames from an aircraft that had been hit twice and landed on a runway with one engine was a success. The pilots of the 7th Photo Reconnaissance Group flew 11,000 sorties between D-Day and the end of the war in Europe. They lost 115 aircraft. The group received 2 Distinguished Unit Citations and produced the photographic coverage that underpinned the Army Map Service's production for the entire Western European campaign. Their names are not on the Normandy Memorial. They are on a plaque at the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, in a display about reconnaissance aviation that most visitors walk past on their way to the fighter exhibits. The fighter pilots have movies. The reconnaissance pilots have a plaque. This is not an injustice exactly. It is an accurate reflection of how the culture of military recognition works, which is to say, it recognizes things it can see. And what the reconnaissance pilots did was invisible almost by definition. They flew to make things visible to others. They were, professionally, transparent. The German military cartographic program had been one of the best in the world in 1941 and 1942.
The Reichsamt für Landesaufnahme had produced topographic coverage of most of Europe before the war, and the Wehrmacht had invested in the survey and distribution infrastructure necessary to get accurate sheets to divisional commanders before operations. German officers in France in 1940, in Russia in 1941, in North Africa in 1942, had generally had what they needed. The maps were good, the production was reliable, the updating pipeline functioned. By 1944, multiple Allied bombing campaigns had struck the facilities that supported German cartographic production. The central printing operations were relocated from Berlin to Saalfeld in Thuringia, too vulnerable in the capital, more secure in a small city in the interior. The relocation preserved the organization but disrupted the production schedule. Sheets that should have been updated quarterly fell months behind.
The personnel who should have been conducting revision surveys were unavailable, pulled into other military assignments, casualties of the attrition that was grinding through every German technical specialty by the third year of the war. The result, by the autumn of 1944, was a German military mapping system producing sheets from survey data that was years out of date, unable to incorporate the ongoing wartime changes. New roads built for military logistics, bridges replaced or relocated, villages expanded or reduced by industrial mobilization, that were continuously altering the landscape those sheets were supposed to represent. German divisional commanders received map sheets in the autumn of 1944 that reflected what the ground had looked like at the time of the last survey. In Belgium and Luxembourg, which had been under German military administration since 1940, those surveys were sometimes 4 and 5 years old. The territory had changed. The maps had not. The specific categories of change that the German maps missed were, individually, minor. A new bridge here, a widened road there, a logging track extended, a ford replaced, a village expanded along a road that the pre-war survey had shown ending at the church. No single change was operationally significant by itself. The cumulative effect of 4 years of unrecorded change across a territory the size of Belgium was a cartographic layer of misinformation overlaid on an otherwise accurate base, accurate for 1940, systematically wrong for 1944, in dozens of small ways that became large when they affected the route selection for a panzer army. The German survey system had been designed for stability. It was optimized for the condition in which the world changed slowly enough that a survey conducted 3 years ago remained accurate enough for military operations. That condition had obtained in European military planning from the Franco-Prussian War through 1939. It had ceased to obtain the moment the war began, because wars change landscapes. They build bridges and blow them up, extend roads and crater them, move industrial facilities and abandon them at a rate that peacetime survey schedules cannot match. The American system had been designed by necessity and in response to failure for a different condition, the condition in which the relevant information was the current information, and current information could only be obtained by flying over the territory and photographing it. The Army Map Service's production pipeline was not faster than the German pipeline in any absolute sense. It was faster in the only sense that mattered. It was current. The German pipeline was thorough. The American pipeline was recent. In a war where the landscape changed every month, recent beat thorough every time. Meanwhile, from the Ruth Building in Maryland, the Army Map Service was printing sheets of those same territories based on aerial photographs flown in the summer of 1944. The lag between the photograph and the printed sheet was measured in weeks. The F-5 pilots flew in July. The Ruth Building processed in August. The printed M641 series reached American units in September and October, 5 months before the Ardennes offensive began. 5 months of aerial photography versus 5 years of unrevised survey data. That was the cartographic gap between the two armies standing across from each other in the Belgian forest on December 16, 1944. December 21, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. The siege has been underway for 4 days. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded in the town, is holding the road junction that von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army needs to pass through on its way to the Meuse. The German commander has sent a demand for surrender.
The American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, has replied with a single word that will become the most famous one-word response in American military history. The reason Bastogne matters. The specific reason this road junction in the middle of the Belgian Ardennes has become the fulcrum of the entire German offensive is partly tactical and partly cartographic. Von Manteuffel's operational plan called for his armor to bypass Bastogne and continue west. The maps he had available showed road routes that would permit this bypass. Some of those routes existed as shown, others existed only on paper. The bypass routes that did not exist as shown forced columns onto the routes that did exist, which converged on Bastogne, which was held. The captured American M641 sheets that were circulating through German staff headquarters in those days showed the road network as it existed in the summer of 1944.
The bypasses that looked viable on the 1938 German sheets and were not viable on the ground in December 1944 were accurately shown as non-viable on the American sheets, shown as logging tracks, seasonal paths, routes that existed but could not support armored vehicles in winter conditions. German staff officers who examined the captured American sheets and compared them to the sheets their own cartographic service had provided, understood, in the specific way that professionals understand evidence they would prefer not to be looking at, what the comparison meant. Von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army came within 4 miles of the Meuse River before it was stopped. His armored columns got closer to their objective than any German unit in the Ardennes offensive. He was, by every account, an able commander working with inadequate means. The maps were one inadequacy among several, but they were not a small one. Now the full account is available.
It begins in February 1943 at Kasserine Pass, where the American Army discovered what it cost to fight in foreign terrain without adequate maps. That discovery was expensive. 6,500 casualties, a corps commander relieved, a 3-week operational pause while the Army reorganized. It was also, in retrospect, cheap at the price, because it happened early enough to matter and late enough to be remembered by the people who had authority to act on it. It runs through Edith Parker's 60-hour curriculum, which translated the accumulated geographical training of a generation of American women into a cartographic production capability that the Army could not have built from military personnel alone. Parker's insight was not brilliant. It was obvious in retrospect. Obvious in the way that most institutional innovations are obvious after someone has done them. The women who had majored in geography and been left professionally unused were available, trained, and willing. The gap between available and deployed required someone to see it. It runs through the Ruth Building in Maryland, camouflaged on a residential street,
where B. McPherson and Marion Frieswick and their colleagues worked at light tables through the extended spring of 1944, producing the sheets that would go ashore at Utah and Omaha and be unfolded in the lanes of the bocage by men who did not know where the sheets had come from. It runs through the 10th Photo Reconnaissance Group at their base in England, through First Lieutenant Wicker flying at 50 feet over the Normandy coast with no guns and a film canister, through the processing pipelines that turned film into prints, into coordinates, into contour lines, into printed sheets in the hands of soldiers. And it ends in a command post in the Ardennes, where a German general held an American map of his own country, and a staff officer used the only word that could describe the experience of being outmapped on home ground by an enemy who had begun the war with Michelin road atlases. Unfair. The word is the verdict. Not on von Manteuffel, who was a professional, doing what professionals do under conditions that were beyond his control. On the systems. The German system had been built to produce excellent maps from thorough surveys on a peacetime schedule. A system optimized for stability and accuracy, for the condition in which the world changed slowly enough that a survey conducted last year was still correct today. The American system had been built, in 20 months, from humiliation and necessity, by a geography professor and a generation of women who had been trained to think spatially, and then told there were no jobs for people who thought spatially, and by pilots who flew alone without guns because that was the job, and by an institution that recognized it was failing and changed. The German system produced the better map of what had been. The American system produced the correct map of what was there now. In the Ardennes in December 1944, that difference was the whole war. The maps brought their men home. The people who made them had names: B. McPherson, Marion Frieswick, Evelyn Lord Pruitt, Edith Parker, James Wicker. The pilots of the 7th and 10th Photo Reconnaissance Groups who flew alone over German cities and French beaches and Belgian forests with cameras where their guns should have been. None of them are on any monument. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency inducted the military mapping maidens into its Hall of Fame in 2015 when B. McPherson was in her 90s and most of her colleagues were gone. The citation used the language of formal recognition, trailblazers, pioneers, foundational contributions, which is the language institutions use when they are acknowledging something they should have acknowledged 50 years earlier. Von Manteuffel lived until 1978. In his post-war interviews, he spoke at length about American firepower, American air supremacy, American logistical depth. He spoke less about the maps. Most German officers did. The cartographic asymmetry was difficult to dramatize. A map does not explode. It does not fire. It sits in a staff officer's hands and tells him, with the quiet precision of good survey data and recent aerial photography, where the road is, where the bridge is, where the logging track goes. But the men on both sides who held those sheets in the Belgian forest in December 1944 knew what they meant. And one of them, looking at an American sheet that showed his own country more accurately than his own army's maps, found the only word available for the experience of losing an advantage that every military theorist had considered inalienable: unfair. That is what it looks like when the system wins. Not with a gun, not with a flag, with a piece of paper printed in Maryland, by women who had been told there were no jobs for people who could read a map. The system won. That is always how it looks.